To just lay out a second, we were at an hour 20, so I needed to break it up.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Well, hello, FC Dallas Curious fans, and welcome to episode number 56 of Third Degree, the podcast. We are, of course, still in the middle of the COVID-19 coronavirus MLS shutdown, so there's not a lot of current activity to talk about. We can only spend so many weeks talking about Lucci having videos for his players and individual workouts with cones, which is pretty damn boring. So in order to try and spice up the podcast a little bit and give us something to talk about, I've chosen to do a historical look back through the history of FC Dallas, through the 25 seasons of FC Dallas. Today is the Dallas Burn era of that look back, and joining me for this purpose is none other than El Jefe himself, the first fan, as we affectionately call him, the founder of the very first FC Dallas supporters group called the Inferno, Dustin Christmann. Dustin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I've transitioned to the portion of the shelter in place where I'm part of a podcast, so I'm glad that you have helped me through this.
Yeah, the shelter in place is a new experience for all of us. Certainly, we've never seen something like this in our lifetime, I imagine. All right, let's start off way back even before Major League Soccer started. Dustin, I knew of you back in, I want to say, 95 probably, because I was doing some research when I was in grad school on Major League Soccer, and I became aware of you early on. So when did you exactly get started in terms of following the league, collecting information in the league, and doing what you were doing before even Dallas had a team?
Okay, so this is going to take a little bit of setup here. I come at this whole fandom, the sports fandom thing, basically through family. My uncle, who's never been married, surprisingly, and I say that a little bit sarcastically once you hear his story, he has been to every single University of Texas football and baseball game, home and away, for the last 40-something years.
Wow.
He is literally married to the University of Texas Athletics. And so when I was a student at UT, I would meet him a lot of times over along the first base side of Dishwalk Field, where he and some friends known as the Wild Bunch would vocally support the UT baseball team, and since they were sitting right above the dugout for the opposing team, rag the opposition as well. So this is where I come by this was my sports fandom upbringing. And so I initially did not like soccer until basically I got the chance to attend the Germany-South Korea game at the '94 World Cup at the Cotton Bowl. I was a couple months out of college at that point, and I went and asked my boss, hey, because it was in the afternoon on a weekday. I said, hey, can I cut out to go to the game? He said, yeah, this is once in a lifetime. So I went to the game, and just seeing the passion of the fans, and seeing the game on the field, and it was a hell of a game. Those of you who remember that Germany went up 3-0 at halftime and then completely fell apart in the second half. It just ran out of gas, and the Koreans, who could run all day and did run all day, scored 2 goals in the second half to make things interesting, but Germany won. So, and at that point, I said, wow, I was hooked on the game. Of course, in 1994, there was no professional league in this country, save for the APSL and the USISL teams. And so there was rumblings about this new league that would be coming called Major League Soccer. And I was like, great. As who knows if we're ever going to get a team in Dallas. And so fast forward to June of 1995. Story in the Dallas Morning News saying, yes, Dallas is going to get a team in Major League Soccer. And I'm like, great. So they announced the first general manager of the team, Billy Hicks. And so they have the press conference down at City Hall to introduce them. And I go, I basically crash it. I'm not a member of any sort of media, but they weren't exactly checking press credentials when it came in. So I just walked right in. And, after the press conference was over, and I went up to Billy and I said, hey, I have this idea that I want to basically start a Sam's Army-like group that's going to support this new team. And he was like, great. Now, he had no idea at the time of what that was gonna be, and frankly, neither did I. And at that point, I then took it upon myself to start the first website devoted to the team, because this was 1995, nobody was on the internet. And so, it's something that I set up, and, there was really information sparse at that point, because, it was a team that just had been announced a few days earlier. So, what information is there going to be other than the fact, oh yeah, we're going to have a team here pretty soon. But gradually, that started, developing, and, so, anything that I could find in the paper. And back in those days, the morning news didn't have a paywall. So, they put something in the paper and it's on their website, and I linked to it, and there you go. I've got content from my Dallas Burn website. And then away we went.
Well, as a side note, I was also at that Germany-South Korea game. So it was
hot.
It was hot. It was nasty hot. So as we started getting closer to the start of the league, the teams began to get players allocated to them, and the ones that came to Dallas that were ones people had heard of, obviously, were Hugo Sanchez and Leonel Alvarez. So give us your thoughts or your early impressions as the team started to come together.
Well, I remember back in those days that I was hopping mad that the Dallas team was not getting any of the USA World Cup '94 heroes. Literally every single team in the league, other than Dallas, well, maybe Tampa. I don't know if Tampa got any World Cup '94 players, but literally everybody else in the league got some USA '94 veteran. John Harkes and at DC, and Eric Winalda in San Jose, and Alexi Lawless and Mike Burns in New England. And so I was hopping mad about that. I was like, okay, but I was pretty much but when we got Hugo Sanchez and Leonel Alvarez, I said, okay, these guys are somewhat these guys are good. So okay, we're not getting any of the local heroes, but we're getting somebody that is some players that have actually done something somewhere along the way. We weren't getting a bunch of APSL and indoor cast-offs as our allocated players. So that was fine. I mean, and honestly, again, I did not really start following soccer until 1994. So you could have told me that Joe Blow was like this really great player, and I would have been like, hot damn. So all that I knew at that point were, my heroes from '94, and, I didn't know that, Hugo Sanchez was like literally the hottest scorer in one of the best leagues in the world for several years straight. I didn't know that. I had to find that out through research. I was like, oh, and then I did. I was like, oh, okay, that's pretty impressive achievement right there. And Leonel Alvarez, okay, he was a starter for the Colombian team in the '94 World Cup. So okay, he's probably pretty good. And And so it was. So those two guys I was really impressed with. Um, the Washington Rodriguez and Mark Santel allocations, they kind of flew under the radar a bit for me. And but Hugo Sanchez and Leonel Alvarez definitely got my attention.
Now, I remember distinctly. Now, I'm not going to say watching the draft. I remember when the draft happened, and there was a list of them players that were put out, that inaugural draft, and I remember thinking, I don't know if you had similar thoughts. I remember thinking, boy, I have no idea who any of these guys are. You're reading the list of players, and you're like, okay, he's a forward. Okay, it's like I didn't know, and I was a soccer follower, and I still 90% of them I had no clue who they were. So it was, all of us were going into that first season blind. We had no idea what we were going to get.
Yeah, I was at the draft party that the Burn had across the street. Their initial headquarters, for those people who don't know, was right there on McKinney Avenue, right across the street from the Hard Rock Cafe. So they had their draft party at the Hard Rock Cafe, and they had a live. They had the hard line from the ticket there at the draft party, and so those of you who remember, well, I mean, it doesn't take too much to remember Mike Reiner because but Greg Williams, he was similar to Rhines in that, didn't really have much time for the game of soccer. So the two of them, doing a live spot from the Hard Rock Cafe for a Major League Soccer draft party, you could see the huge question marks above their heads as they were announcing over there, yes, the Burn has drafted Jason Kreis. and to be fair, I wasn't much better off. The only difference between me and them is that I had no idea who those guys were, but I figured they were worth my time, whereas those guys is like, well, okay, it's a paycheck,
We forget how off the radar Jason Kreis was. I believe he was something like a fifth or sixth round selection. I can't remember exactly. And it was fifth. Yeah, and people even at the time were like, "Well, that guy's never going to pan out." Little did we know later what a great player he would become. Of course.
Yeah, and the only players I can tell you from that draft are Ted Eck. He was number one,
right,
and Jason Kreis was in the fifth round. Everyone else, not so much.
Yeah, not so much. All right. So at the time, I was still living in Boston as I was just finishing up school up there. So I was not here in Dallas for the first season, but you were. So leading up to the first home opener, first tell us a little bit about, I'm assuming that the Inferno got going for the very first game. So if you could tell us a little bit about how the Inferno happened, because I think it was an important component of the Burn years of FC Dallas, and also into that first home opener where there's 27,000 people at the Cotton Bowl.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I started at the same time as my really rinky-dink website was a email discussion list, which
I remember that.
Yeah. So for those of you kids out there, in the days before social media and discussion boards and all that, you literally had email discussion lists where you would send an email to an address, and then it would get forwarded to all these people, and then they would reply to it and get forwarded back. And so you would literally carry on discussions through email. And so if there was a particularly hot topic, your inbox might get filled up with like 100 emails, where people were giving their hot sports opinions on this, player or this game or whatever. So before the, in the run up to in the months leading up to the first game, I kind of started and said, okay, we're going to do a supporters group here. And one of the things I did on my website was, okay, and so a lot of people said, oh yeah, I'd like to be part of this as well. And so one of the things that we put up on the website is like, okay, what should we name the supporters group? And the two finalists, if I remember correctly, were the Inferno and the Burn Ward, which some people, I got some pushback about the Burn Ward from some adults who said, well, that may not go over very well among, since Dallas is home to a really big burn center. And I was like, okay, well, hopefully that maybe it doesn't win, And so the Inferno was chosen, and so there was all these people that were brought together in on the internet back in the mid '90s, before almost anyone had heard of the internet. And so we said, okay, we're going to be part of the supporters group. We're going to sit over in the corner and all that and stuff, because they, pretty much the ends of the Cotton Bowl were, they're 100 yards away from the field, or however far it was. And so they put us in the corner, so we'd be right there up on the field, and
right.
yet not taking up valuable sideline real estate. And so we had literally never seen. Well, many of us had never seen. A few of us had seen each other before that first game, and so we were like, okay, we're going to have our tailgate in this part of the Fair Park parking lot. And so literally a whole lot of people who coming together for the first time in this. And then we were like, okay, we're here. Okay, it's about half an hour till game time. Let's go in. And so we assumed our place in the Cotton Bowl, which was, right there, right over one corner. And then we had our drums and our, and our, noisemakers and whatever else, and proceeded to come up with any chance that we could at that point.
I remember from the Burn days and the Cotton Bowl days that the Cotton Bowl was universally considered across the league the best surface, period, far and away.
Yes.
Was it great right from the get-go in '96?
Oh yeah. I mean, if it weren't for the Burn, the Cotton Bowl would have been used 3 days a year. For the Texas OU game, for the Fair Park Classic, and for the January 1st game before it moved to Jerry World. So literally 3 days a year. So SMU was also playing its home games there at that time. So in April of '96, the field was in pretty good shape, and and we were close enough to the field where you could actually look at the field and you could say, wow, this looks like almost like AstroTurf. It's so smooth and green. It was a really great surface. You could tell it was. Now, later on in the season, once SMU started playing there and they started having to mark all the football lines in white and the soccer lines in yellow, you could start seeing getting chewed up a little bit. But yeah, it was a really great field for most of that first season.
So people may not remember or may not be aware, I haven't looked it up, is that the club started really well, started 6-2. So I'm sure the fans are all feeling really good. And there were some pretty lopsided wins that year: 4-1 over San Jose, 4-1 over New England, 5-2 over LA. And the most interesting thing about the LA game is in that game is one of what I think is one of these signature moments in the entire history of the franchise. Maybe top 10, maybe top 20. And that's Hugo Sanchez's bicycle kick, which was one of the goals of the year that season. That's basically a legendary moment in franchise history. It happens pretty quickly, right? In the first half of the season, pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, I almost want to say it was, I want to say it was in his first game with the club, which wasn't until May, because he was still finishing up his season with Celaya in Mexico. And so he finishes up his season, and then he comes to Dallas, and the scene at the airport back in those pre 9/11 days, where any Joe Blow could walk up to a gate and and greet a player as he's stepping off a plane. It was a mad scene at DFW when he's stepping off the plane. Everybody and their brother who wanted to see Hugo Sanchez was there, and so you could see this look on his face, like, on the one hand, he's a little bit taken aback by all of this. On the other hand, he is like, well, of course they're, turning out for me. I'm El Pinta Pichichi, why wouldn't they be turning out like this for me? And so he was there. And so, like a week later, he was in his first game, and that's when he scored the bicycle. And everybody was, just losing their minds at that point because, oh man, we were a great team already, and now we got Hugo Sanchez. Hot damn! This team is going to the championship. But might have been a little bit of irrational exuberance on our part here with 25 years of hindsight.
Right. So that season, you have Diego Sonora, who's a great allocation. Mark Santel, as you mentioned. Mark Dodd has a great season. Jason Kreis leads the team in scoring. And along with Lionel, all five of those guys make the All-Star game. Dodd ends up winning Keeper of the Year. Alvarez is named to MLS Best 11. We'll get back to Dodd in a little bit. But honestly, in 1996, I think you could arguably make the case that Lionel Alvarez should have been league MVP, not just franchise MVP. And he honestly set the tone for really over a decade for this franchise.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, the team's record with and without Lionel Alvarez was so radically different. And you could actually measure this pretty easily because, number one, Lionel Alvarez got a yellow card in damn near every game, which means, every 5 games he got to sit a suspension because of accumulation. And number two, the league didn't stop for international breaks at that point. So when Colombia had a game and called him up, we were missing Lionel Alvarez. So there was a insignificant number of games that he missed that year. And so the team's record, without him in the lineup was so dramatically different from with him in it. I mean, you could sense his presence when he was out there on the field. Like, okay, you twerps are going to do what I ask you to without any sort of dispute, and this is how it's going to be. I mean, he just took the team by the scruff of the neck. And there were a lot of young players on that team, a bunch of guys who'd been playing in beer leagues. So this was like literally their first really, truly professional experience. And, so meanwhile, Lionel Alvarez, he's been a professional in this game for, however many years at that point. So he knew what it meant. And he was a very much dominant personality on that team and really took it by the scruff of the neck. And whatever good things that team did that year, it was due in large part to number 14.
Yeah, Jason Kreis has said that Lionel is the biggest influence on his entire career. And I'll tell you 2 stories that I think are fun. One I think I've told before, which is that Brian Haynes says that after they were done training as a Burn club, that Lionel would take the entire midfield and he would organize his own training session where the 4 or 5 midfielders would play against a Hispanic local side, 4 players or 5 players versus 11. And they would play those guys in the afternoon in order to, which is, 4 versus 11 is crazy, although it is professionals versus amateurs, but nonetheless. And then my other story was, as I mentioned at the time I was in New England, I was working as the Red Hat for the Revolution, which is the guy that tells them to kick off. And I remember distinctly when the Burn came up there, Alvarez and Sanchez, of course, are going through their typical dramatics that they do. And the crowd is on them and booing them and having a hard time. And there's a moment where Alvarez and Sanchez come over to the home crowd basically and show, I think it was Lionel's leg. They pull up Lionel's shorts and Hugo gestures to his leg. And on the inside of his thigh are these 4 distinct black marks from cleats with blood trails running down the inside of his thigh from somebody from the Revolution that had stomped and cleated him on the inside of his leg. And, he's just playing right through that like it's nothing other than his complaining to the referee. But it's like that's the kind of guy he was. He would literally run through the proverbial run through walls. Now, this guy literally would play with his leg falling off.
Well, yeah, and he, the reason why he was almost a guarantee to pick up a booking in every game is because he gave as good as he got it. I mean, if you think you were going to kick Lionel Alvarez and there wasn't going to be payback coming, you were dead wrong. And he gave the payback, and the referee rung him up, and then every 5 games he would sit his suspension. But yeah, I mean he was. his face is indelibly stuck in my mind when I think about, you know, soccer hard men, because he was very much one of those guys. The guy, he was tough. He would give out some punishment, and yet he also had some measurable skill. I mean, the guy, you're not playing for Colombia in the mid '90s, which was arguably one of the best national teams in the world at that stage, unless you're pretty good. And the guy was, I will forever have a soft spot in my heart for Leonel Alvarez. I mean, the guy was, and no, I won't say never. I saw him smile maybe three times in the number of years that the Burn had him, and all of those times were off the field. He never had a smile. The Burn could score and everybody be celebrating. He didn't even have a smile then. I mean, the guy was all business when he stepped over that line onto the pitch, and he was, I mean, nothing but a professional.
So the Burn end the year on a 2-6 run, which is not a good finish. The wheels are coming off a little bit, but they still finished second in the West. And then in the playoffs, they run into Kansas City. And I remember Kansas City being one of the first ever rivals for FC Dallas. Before Chicago, before LA, before anybody, I remember Kansas City being the hated team with punchy Ron Newman over there on the bench yelling at everybody.
Oh, yeah.
And in those 96 playoffs, they ended up losing 2-1. The Dallas, it's a habit. The Dallas Burn did. Specifically, like there was a loss in game 3 back in Dallas, that 3-2 loss. Could you think you could make the case that was the start of the hatred with Kansas City, that playoff game?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it started before then, because Ron Newman, I mean, for those people who have no knowledge of this from the NASL days and the MISL days, he was always a bit of a character. And that certainly continued on when he was the head guy of the Wiz. And
the Wiz, that's right.
Yes, the Kansas City Wiz.
Yeah.
And so he was certainly a character then, gesticulating and making a fool out of himself on the sideline. But you don't have the amount of success that he had over the years unless you knew a few things about the game. And he had, his team in Kansas City was basically a combination of indoor guys, who, I was kind of dismissive of, even though, most of the guys for the Burn, had a lot of indoor experience, and, and a bunch of, donkeys, especially along the back line. So they were a very hateable team even before that series. And the way that the Burn lost to them was so, it was tough, because they actually had the lead in game 2, and I think the way they did it in those days is they did the first, I'm trying to remember how it went. They did the first game in the lower seed, and then the second and third game, if necessary, in the home of the higher seed. Basically to save on travel costs, so you weren't going back and forth.
Right.
And the same reason for the 2-3-2 format that they have in the NBA Finals. So in the first game in Kansas City, the Burn had the lead, if I remember correctly, and
yes, they did.
Dante Washington had, he had an open goal shot, that basically would have put that game away, and it was saved off the line, at the last second. The Wiz come back and win the game, and so the Burn are down 1-0 in the series. And so they come back to Dallas. Dallas wins, and and then in game 3, they lose to the Wiz in a shootout.
The dreaded
Which
shootout.
was, yeah, it was. I mean, I am probably one of the I wouldn't say the biggest shootout apologists that you will find. I mean, I will say there's a place for them, because some games there was just no other entertainment other than the shootout. But it is still a crappy way to decide a game, and not only to decide a game, but to decide the clinching game 3 of a playoff series. It just left a bad taste in my mouth, and it was just the worst thing ever. And so at that point, I just had the disdain I had for the Kansas City franchise was cemented.
Well, people don't know. A lot of people won't know that the Burn finished with an average of 16,000 people in the stands that year, which is the third highest in franchise history, and just loses out of the number 2 spot by only barely a little. But on to 1997, Hugo Sanchez leaves. Leonel Alvarez leaves to go to Necaxa for what I can only assume was a fat paycheck.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Veracruz.
Veracruz? I thought it was Necaxa.
Yep, it was Veracruz.
See, you know better than me, because I was still in New England at this time.
Oh, okay.
So Alvarez is gone.
I'm glad you're saying this, because I'm 48 years old, and there's a lot of stuff I'm forgetting at this point. So I'm glad that I do have these moments of lucidity.
Yeah, Google says you're right. It is indeed Veracruz. My mistake. See, I learn something new every day. Regardless, that's probably a pretty good paycheck, I'd imagine. Washington Rodriguez is gone. In comes Daniel Pineda to replace Alvarez. Alain Suter comes in, the great Swiss playmaker. And Zarco Rodriguez, I did not realize I had forgotten was an allocation. He comes in that season. And Damian Alvarez, who's another mercurial, talented attacking player, comes in. And then Wade Weber was added via the draft. So there's a lot of good adds. Suter, in particular, was amazing, particularly right out of the gate. He was the player of the month for May that very first season. And between him and Damian, who's another phenomenal talent, but was obviously a big headache, those two guys were pretty electric, I remember, in 97 for the Burn.
Oh, yeah. And then they already had Dante Washington, who they acquired through trade in 96, who was knocking in the goals. And it was, I mean, these guys were so good. I mean, these guys were so effective that Jason Kreis, who all anybody remembers about Jason Kreis is that he knocked in, goals by the ton for this team, but he couldn't really get on the field that much for the Burn in 97. I mean, he couldn't get in. I mean, he was always sort of a tweener player. Neither a pure striker nor a pure attacking midfielder. So he was always, where do you put him? One of those situations. So he couldn't, get in at attacking midfield because of Alain Suter, and he couldn't get in at forward because you had Dante Washington and Damian, who were also really productive. So the guy who we think of as one of the 4 guys on this club's Mount Rushmore, I mean, he could not get on the field very much that season.
Yeah, that was the only season Jason did not lead the team in scoring for the first 4 or 5 years.
Yep.
Yeah. So that season, Damian, Mark Dodd, Diego Sonora, Alain Suter, Dante Washington, Mark Santel all make the All-Star game. But to be honest, and looking back now, 1997 really is the season of Mark Dodd. He had 183 saves, which is still the club record and still second in MLS to this day for a single season. And of course, there's the 1997 U.S. Open Cup final, which is Dodd's, if you want, masterpiece game, where he played like 2 days after his mother had passed away. And he pretty much single-handedly won the first piece of silverware in franchise history.
Oh, yeah. And, Mark Dodd, he is probably one of the, I would say probably one of the most underappreciated players in this franchise's history, because he was so important in that first couple 3 years. I mean, because he he literally saved everything that came into his area. And at that point, he was already and I'm going to say euphemistically, an experienced goalkeeper. I mean, but he had command of his area. He could read the game very well, and whenever he would make the save, a lot of times before the opposing player even shot. There are a lot of goalkeepers who do it on physical talents. He did it pretty much on guile, and he was a huge reason why the team did as well as it did in the first years. I mean, the team made the playoffs, which for however many years straight before 2003, which I'd rather not talk about too much. And he was a big reason why, because you knew that if you could just put in, a couple goals at the other end, Dodd was going to save your bacon at the back. He is nothing but a great guy to talk to as well. I mean, all of those guys from the early years, the guys who had been, all the guys outside of the allocated players in those first few years are guys that had been making, a couple $300 a game playing in the various different lower level leagues and indoor soccer. And, all of a sudden they're in a big time professional league, but they're still the same guys. They still knew where they came from. And so they were all very approachable, and that included Mark Dodd. So you'd run into him, after a game or, in around town or whatever, and you'd say hi to him, and he would be sociable, and I'm sure he still is. And, you ask him, hey, how about this? And he'd talk to you for a few minutes. He was definitely not one of those guys like, oh yeah, beat it, like so many pro athletes are nowadays. But yeah, I have nothing but good things to say about Mark Dodd. I mean, he was, and I will forever put him on my top 5 goalkeepers. If we're doing a top 5 goalkeepers in franchise history in another 25 years, when this team is 50 years old, I'm still going to have him in my top 5, no matter who comes in the next 25 years.
Yeah. I remember watching the Open Cup final, and I remember that I didn't know much about the Open Cup before I remember it happening. And it happened after the season was actually over. I'm sure you'll remember. And it was being on TV. I remember, at least my memory says I watched it live, and I remember, I think, jumping up and down when Zarco makes the PK at the end of the game. I remember it being a long, cold night and a slog and a long game. Do you have memories of that game when it happened?
Well, I was at the game, so.
Well, then I'm sure you do.
Yeah, so there were six or eight of us that drove up in a van from Dallas to Indianapolis for that game, and we were joined in the stands there by a lot of Tom Sohn's friends and family who came over from Chicago, because he was still with the Burn at that point.
Right.
And so, yes, it was cold, and Dodd played out of his mind. And one thing that I will always remember about that game is that, both goalkeepers, both Scott Garlick for DC and Dodd for Dallas, they both played out of their minds. And, you'll hear about a 0-0 game, and the normal assumption is, oh God, it was dreary. But this was the exception that proved the rule, because both teams were, they were playing for it. They both wanted to win this game, and they were taking shot after shot after, and both guys were coming up huge. And I will forever say this about this game: Bruce Arena did Scott Garlick dirty, because in extra time he subbed out Garlick for Tom Prestis for the shootout. And Prestis he was a good goalkeeper in this league for a number of years, but the reason why the Burn won and the and DC United didn't is because Tom Prestis did not make a single save in the shootout. Then again, neither did Dodd. I mean, because Diego Sonora, Raul Diaz Arce put his shot over the bar, and so because of that, the Burn won. But he and Scott Garlick Mark Dodd and Scott Garlick were basically standing on their heads all night long, saving anything that came into their area that looked remotely dangerous. And it was very much, you say it was probably the highlight of, I cannot think of a single greater performance by Dodd in his time in Dallas with the Burn. I mean, and that's how it is in a lot of these silverware games. Is you'll have one or two guys who will just play out of their minds for that game, and that's will be what wins the game. And on that night, it was Mark Dodd who played out of his mind, and on a very cold night after the season. And it was after the season because another thing that I will forever hold against Arena is that he was complaining loudly and bitterly about having to play the Open Cup final during the season. So the federation said, okay, fine, we'll do it after the season. So it was like literally the week after they won their second MLS Cup in a row. And here you go. Open Cup final.
Here's your reward. All right, so further cementing the hatred of the Kansas City Wiz, or maybe they were the Wizards by that point.
They were the Wizards because the electronics chain in the Northeast
sued them, right?
Sued them, yeah. And it was probably fortuitous that they sued him because that was one of many horrible names from the early days of the league.
We could do a whole episode on the poor branding at the start of MLS. All right, so the Burn went 1-3 against them in '97, but they still managed to finish third that year, and they faced LA in the playoffs, who had finished second. Now Dallas had been 1-3 against LA that season. The only win came way back in April. Yet the Burn swept LA in the playoffs. It was a really fantastic series. Winning in LA on the shootout, and then Dante Washington had a brace when the game came back to Dallas in the 3-0 win. That was a pretty good series, if I remember from memory.
Yep. Well, it was good for us,
Yeah, good for the Burn. And then, of course,
it's always more entertaining to win.
Yeah, and then, of course, for not the last time, the damn Colorado Rapids knocked the Burn out in round 2.
Yes, and that's I mean, I could remember going in to that, after. So the Burn knock out the LA, and it looks like Durr's got them playing well. Everybody, all the the team is clicking on all cylinders because they finished out the season not very well, if I remember correctly. But they come into the LA series, they win the shootout in LA, great, and then they come home and then they flat out beat them in Dallas. And so everyone's like, okay, the team has turned the corner because they had been kind of inconsistent all year. And this is where they make their big charge to, MLS Cup. And then Colorado, who was not very good that year, but you didn't have to be good to be all that good to make the playoffs in those days. They swept the Wizards, who were the number 1 seed in the West. And everybody's still thinking, oh yeah, okay, Colorado's still not all that good. Well, Colorado then proceeds to, basically turn the game in Dallas into game 1 in Dallas into a slog. I think they win 1-0, and then Dallas, and then game 2, Dallas, I think, goes up 1-0, and then in the second half, Colorado ties it, and then I will forever have Colorado's winning goal in that game too etched into my mind because it was Chris Henderson.
Yep.
And he scores it off of a side volley.
Mm.
And and under normal circumstances, it would have been a really great goal. But that, it was the goal that, knocked the Burn out of the playoffs in '97. So, of course, I have nothing but disdain for it. And then little did I know at that point, but this was going to be the start of 20-something years of suffering at the hands of the Colorado Rapids.
Yeah, it's the first of many, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
God. Yeah,
those guys.
You'll get to talk with other people about the FC Dallas years of suffering to the Colorado Rapids. But I'm here for the Burn years of suffering to the Colorado Rapids.
Yeah. All right, so moving on to 1998, Leonel Alvarez comes back as an allocation, and the Burn fans finally got something that they had been asking for from obviously the very beginning, and that was a U.S. men's national team player when Chad Deering joined after the '98 World Cup.
Yeah, and Chad Deering, I mean, he is, he is someone that, I think was a little bit underappreciated.
Definitely.
Because, for years, like you said, the fans said, oh, yeah, give us a U.S. World Cup player. And so we get one. And he's off the team that finishes 32nd out of 32 in France. Mm. And so there's almost a collective, not like that,
not what we meant.
As Oscar Wilde once said, when the gods wish to punish us, they answer our prayers.
Right.
But the thing that I will always remember about the '98 season is how it started so promisingly, because the team that seemed to, that was on its way up at the end of '97, the Colorado series notwithstanding, they won silverware, and they started off the '98 season pretty well because you've got Alan Suter, you've got Dante Washington, you've got Damian Alvarez, and now you've got Leonel Alvarez to add a little bit of steel in the midfield. And you think, okay, this team is going to go places. And they started out really well. And then Alan Suter gets injured. And he gets injured in the most Dallas Burn League run way possible. He steps into a hole in the field at Green Hill School and injures his hip. And because he's Alan Suter and really isn't on board with traditional medical techniques, does not have, any surgery or anything done on it. And so that's the last we ever see of Alan Suter. And the team is unable to do anything offensively the end of the year and suffers some pretty staggering losses to, everybody, but particularly the LA Galaxy, who were scoring goals that year as easily as most people breathe.
Yes.
And so they rung up. I think it's still a league record for the biggest win ever.
I believe so. Yes.
In Dallas, that June on a rainy Thursday night, that was broadcast nationally by ESPN2.
I was there.
Yes, and the
8-1.
8-1.
Yeah.
Yes, and the one of the more underappreciated things about the game was that Damian Alvarez actually scored an Olympico in that game.
Yeah, first in history, right?
Directly off the corner, and everybody forgets that. And everybody remembers that Haruk Karapetian scored a hat trick, which turned an already bad 5-1 deficit into an 8-1 loss. And he scored this hat trick in 10 minutes in the last 10 minutes of the game.
Natural hat trick.
Natural hat trick, yes. And so, it was it was raining, and I think that was the first time that the fans ever really got on Dave Durr at that point, even though, he wasn't, he put his best team out there. And the fact is that Leonel Alvarez got himself sent off early in the first half, and so LA was already lethal in '98 offensively. And so if you give them a man advantage, well, Katie barred the door. So, but the fans got on Dave Durr, and in retrospect, unfairly. Most of the time when you get on the coach in soccer, it's pretty unfair. But I think that night particularly so.
Well, we can't talk about '98 without talking about two good acquisitions. One was that Matt Jordan was drafted, but that doesn't become important until later. But the more important one is that later in the year, Damian, who we've been talking about a lot so far, got traded for Oscar Pareja from New England. Now, Oscar only played 6 games that year for Dallas, but I mean, little did we know, right, what a huge piece he was going to become.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was, when the trade happened, I was like, wow, this, who's this Pareja guy? And already you could tell that he was going to be something special, because I think the first game he actually played for the Burn, and my memory on this may be completely faulty, but it was against the Metro Stars, and the Burn actually went down 2 men to the Metros. I think one of the red cards was dished out to Deering, but they won. The Burn actually came back and won. Now that part I'm at least certain about, but they won.
That
they
was
beat
a
the
2-0
Metros
win.
then.
2-0 win.
It was a 2-0 win. Okay,
yeah,
but
I have it in front of me as long as I know that.
Yeah. Okay. So and you go on 2 men against anybody. You're not expecting to win anything.
No, you're not.
And I remember that Pareja, put a couple of, helped make a couple of those, and helped make at least one of those goals happen with a pinpoint pass. And at that point, I said, well, okay, we might do something this year. And so he comes in, and he stabilizes things. And if I also remember correctly, the last second win against Chicago, I think he had the assist to Zarco Rodriguez on the winning goal, because I think Dodd collects the ball, he passes it to Pareja, who then passes it to Zarco, who then scores the goal with like 2 seconds left.
Oh, now you're getting ahead of ourselves now.
All
that was coming up. You're gonna spoil it now.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, it's all right. That was the next thing we were going to talk about. It's like you can't go through 1998 without talking about the Chicago Fire, because the game you're just mentioning, when they scored with 17 seconds left on the clock when that play started. It's like that game is the game that basically created the Chicago Fire rivalry, the Brimstone Cup rivalry. And I'm sure you remember that they were the Dante Washington scored to tie the game at 2 in the 83rd minute, and they're literally the clock counted down back then. I know you remember this.
Yep. Oh,
and there's 17 seconds left on the clock when that play started, and I believe there were 3 seconds left when Zarco scored.
Yep. And the crazy thing about the Fire is that coming into the '98 season, I was convinced, absolutely 100.00% convinced, that Miami was going to be, a good team, and that Chicago was going to stink out loud, because they were getting all these old fart Eastern European players. Purely for ethnic marketing reasons, that these guys weren't going to be able to do crap. And then, well, as it turns out, these guys were pretty good. And, and they inflicted the most frustrating losses on the Burn that season, because the Burn they beat the Burn pretty solidly in Chicago. And you look at the scores and say, oh, well, Chicago was clearly the better team on that day. But you watch the games, and the Burn actually played well, but they just could not break through.
Right.
And then, meanwhile, the Fire would just, do whatever it was, and then and then here's the key component: Peter Novak would make a brilliant pass, and then all of a sudden, there's a goal at the other end for the Fire, and it was so frustrating because you feel like the Burn are playing well, but the problem with the Burn in '98 is that they couldn't score to save their lives.
Once they lost Suter, yeah.
Yeah, once they lost Suter, and unfortunately for them, they got to play the Fire after they lost Suter, and so it was very frustrating. And so when the Burn beat them on that last second goal at the Cotton Bowl, it was so cathartic. As finally we got these guys, and like you said, that's probably the birthplace of that particular rivalry, of the Brimstone Cup rivalry. But I don't want to spoil anything.
Yeah, there's more to come.
Anymore?
Yeah. All right. So unfortunately, what was already not a great season went to worse in the playoffs when FC Dallas, I did it again. The Burn faced the LA Galaxy for the second year in a row, and this time the Galaxy get revenge by stomping the tar out of Dallas in LA by a 6-1 scoreline, and then the Burn actually go up 2-0 in the second game in Dallas, and then allow the Galaxy to come back with 3 goals in about 8 minutes to win game 2 and take this series. So that season ended as badly as any season, just about. I mean, it's not just a loss; it's it's a destroying loss in the playoffs.
Oh yeah, it was. Well, see, I remember the first game in LA when they stomped a 6-1, scoreline into the Burn. I was like, well, yeah. That's what it do this year.
Yeah.
And so, coming back to Dallas, they went up 2-0. I said, oh, maybe we'll make this interesting. And
nope.
Nope. And I remember that, if I remember correctly, Carlos Amorcio, who they had, the LA had acquired mid-season because they didn't have enough scoring already. He got a goal or 2 in that game as well. So that and everybody's at the Cotton Bowl saying, well, this sucked.
Yeah, he had a brace. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, wow. I'm gratified that you're that you're endorsing my
in the 6-1 game. He had the brace. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and the brace. Okay. Yeah. I have no idea what he did in the Cotton Bowl. I seem to remember
the Cotton Bowl was Ezra Hendrickson, Paul Caligiuri, and Clint Mathis was the 3, and then coming back.
Oh, Clint Mathis. Yes.
Yeah. And the LA version of Clint Mathis. He'll come up again later too, by the way.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
No, but that season stunk in so many reasons. Probably the biggest reason why that season seemed so bad is because it had come on the heels of a season which had been so promising. The '97 season was so promising because they did something in the playoffs. They won the Open Cup. It looked like they were, getting it together as a team. And then in '98, just about everything that fell apart, that could have fallen apart, did.
Yeah,
and
Coach Durr told me that was the only season he actually lost the locker room that year. They all tuned him out and quit listening.
Oh wow! Well, you know what? I think a lot of the fan base, tuned him out. And the thing about it is, if you look at the record on the wins and losses, 15-17, not that bad.
Yeah.
Almost 500. Of course, you get the shootout in there. It's kind of skewing things. But I think there were just so many really bad losses that year that a lot of people, it just seemed worse than it really was.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right, which now brings us on to the 1999. Excuse me, I can talk. Which now brings us on to the 1999 season, which in fact is one of the best seasons in club history.
Yes.
Other than really, as you say, that Suter loss in the '98 caused big problems. But in 1999, the Burn ended up 19-13 on 51 points. Deering and Pareja in the midfield are clicking and going crazy. Matt Jordan takes over in net. He's terrific. Paul Broom gets drafted. Bobby Ryan gets drafted. And obviously, Bobby Ryan was not impactful right away, but certainly I don't think anybody could have known then what Bobby would be, what he became over the history of this franchise.
Yeah, I mean, Bobby Ryan, I guess that's the way it goes with this team, is like the guys that have become absolute legends for this team, they start in such... they start in such, I don't want to say humble, but they start in such lightly regarded places because, my Mount Rushmore for this team is Oscar Pereira, Jason Kreis, Bobby Ryan, and Matt Hedges. Not a single one of those players came to this team with a lot of fanfare.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the Mount Rushmore for, say, the Galaxy, I mean, you're going to have a lot of people put David Beckham on there.
Yes.
Well, there is no greater star that has ever existed in this league than David freaking Beckham, and he was already one of the biggest stars in the history of the game when he got to LA.
Yeah.
But in Dallas, it's different. Every club legend has, basically made his name with the club. And Bobby Ryan is certainly no exception there. Because my big memory of Bobby Ryan is that, and this I got an extra media guide that year somehow, and I was going to send it to everyone's favorite internet troll, Chicago Fire fan, Michael Seagroves.
Right.
And at the kickoff luncheon that year, I had this extra media guide, and I wanted every single player to sign his or her page in the media guide. This might have been 2000, actually. It was 2000 or 2001. He wanted him to sign, each player to sign "The Fire Suck" with his signature. Bobby Ryan refused to do that, and he was just too dadgum nice of a guy. I mean, he would not even, have a little fun at the expense of this team's biggest rival at that time. And I was like, well, the guy's still fairly new. He doesn't get it yet. Well, you know what? So be it. But this guy, I mean, you could see, the fact is that, I think he played just about every position for this team except for goalkeeper. And even if you want to break it down by, even if you want to get really granular by center back versus outside back, or he played darn near every position for this team except for goalkeeper. And that just exemplifies he was the epitome of the good soldier. And he always gave 100%, and he wasn't just he's still up near the top, not too far from the top of the scoring chart, all-time scoring charts for this team. A lot of people, forget that he started his life with this team as a forward, as a withdrawn forward, and doing the, this sort of Jason Kreis kind of business. And, and he was pretty darn good. I mean, he had a couple of hat tricks along the way, and just the nicest guy. And I mean, when people talk about what a loss he was when he passed in, I think, 2011, I mean, it is absolutely not hyperbole with this guy. I mean, he was a huge, 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 huge part of the spirit of this club.
I agree with that completely. The other thing that happened in 1999 that was a huge, massive deal was that a certain website called Third Degree started doing practice observations. I imagine that was a gigantic bone for the club to get that going. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, no, yeah, I remember reading some of these practice observations, and my exact thoughts were, they let them do that? They let them
they did.
Come in and then write down literally everything that they're doing in practice? And I was like, well, if so, then, more power to them. But yeah, it was, I mean, all the, people, I cannot for the life of me believe that, people can say that Dallas is not a soccer market and say it with a straight face, because the amount of soccer knowledge and the soccer appreciation in this town is far more than you find in a lot of other places. And I think a lot of it is due to, literally, I guess now decades of, hard work by yourself, by Steve Davis, who will, and by Peter, who will go and talk about, the game in terms more than just, if you hit the ball with the hand, that's not allowed.
Yeah. Explaining offsides, right?
Yeah, that would take up a few newspaper columns right there, is
right.
finding offsides. But but the fact is that Third Degree was probably one of the first media outlets that I remember in this league, in this country even, outside of the specialized, Soccer America or any of the publications in that ilk, that actually talked about the game to the level of detail that you would expect to see in baseball or football or basketball. The strategies, what is this guy trying to do here, and not just, Jim Bob scored a goal here, and Freddie Mac scored a goal at the other end. Just the basic, hand wavy, anybody can get it sort of level. But to actually talk about what each team is trying to do strategically, and why that's a good thing, why that's not a good thing. I mean, that Third Degree was probably one of the first things that I could ever remember, and it's still probably one of the few that I can talk about, that actually covers the game to that level, with a certain depth of maturity.
So, well, that's been our goal all along.
And that's the reason why I am a Patreon supporter of Third Degree, and you Mr. Podcast listener or Ms. Podcast listener should be one too, because Buzz brings the information and detail that you demand as an FC Dallas curious listener.
Thank you, Dustin. I appreciate that. That has been our goal from the beginning, to be professional and trying to give the league and the team coverage at the level that you would see for, say, the Cowboys or other pro sports. But let's talk more about the team. Let's go back to 1999. 1999 is for sure, above anything else, is the year of Jason Kreis. He leads the team in scoring for the third time in 4 years. He's the first American-born league MVP. He also makes the best 11, of course. When you're MVP, that happens. First 15 and 15 goal and assist season in MLS history. Wins the Golden Boot for the league. He obviously has one of the great seasons, probably the greatest season in the history of the franchise, and maybe even one of the great seasons, and probably right up there in the top five, certainly, in terms of the MVP of all time in the league in terms of individual single seasons. So I think you can't not talk about the season without talking about what a player he was that year.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and the thing about it is that I don't think that there are many of us on the outside looking in who would have guessed that was coming. But what I remember from that season is that Coach Durr, made the decision to play Jason in a more advanced position. Play him closer to goal.
Right.
More as an outright forward. And so he got so many goals that year. And I'm convinced simply because he was, closer to the goal, and which, go figure, closer to the goal, you score more goals. But, and it seems to me that year, I mean, it seemed like there was more of a emphasis on that being his first and second responsibility, score goals. Because that was something that was definitely lacking in '98. It's like we didn't have anybody who could really put the ball in the net, and So, and I think the other thing that I always remember in the '99 season for is the Graziani signing, trade.
Trade, yeah.
Yes, because I think by the time the Graziani trade happened, people around the league, other teams around the league, were starting to kind of figure this out. Okay, Jason Kreis is scoring all these goals. Maybe we should, devote a little bit more attention to him. And so if you look at how the team was doing that year, they were kind of, he was starting to hit a sort of a lull in scoring, and the team correspondingly was kind of hitting a lull in results. They weren't getting quite the number of wins that they had been before. And then they trade, the player that nobody ever thought that they would ever trade, in ever, Leonel Alvarez for Ariel Graziani.
Yeah,
and
go ahead.
And my memory of the Graziani trade was I was driving to Austin, one to do whatever, I can't even remember, and I get a call on my cell phone from Pete, and he says they just traded Leonel Alvarez for Ariel Graziani. I'm like, what? Because it was so amazing to me that they would trade literally the heart and soul of the team for another forward. Like, Kreis is scoring a bunch of goals. What do we need another forward for? But I think Graziani getting to Dallas, he helped take a lot of heat off of Kreis, and Kreis was able to start resuming, his blistering scoring pace, and he was also able to set up Graziani for a bunch of the goals that he had too. So it was one of those, he didn't take. It was one of those trades. You think about, you're signing another forward. Is he going to take away goals from the first forward? No, he's helping to make more goals happen by basically providing an outlet for the other forward. And the fact of the matter is, Kreis is not, he's not now because he's in his 40s, but he was never a out and out striker, and Graziani was.
Right.
And that certainly, those two different styles certainly complemented each other fabulously. And I always think about Coach Durr's you always want to have two kinds of soup quote. When he was talking about Kreis and Graziani, he said, you always want to have two kinds of soup, available. And they were the perfect embodiment of them. They were two different kinds of forwards, but they worked well together, and they made so much more happen. I mean, this team's probably, the years that this team has been best offensively is when they had both those guys.
Yeah, if you remember, the league purchased Graziani for about $2 million, but he only played 2 games for New England before the trade, and then comes to Dallas and he scores 4 goals in 8 games. But really, that year it was the playoffs. He went crazy because he opens the scoring in Game 1 against the defending champs, right? And then he gets the game winner in Game 3. And then in round 2, he scores... scores in the loss, the opening loss, and then he has a brace in Game 2, which they win. So, honestly, that stretch of when he got here is pretty much the hottest run by a player I can remember in Dallas history.
Oh, yeah. And, the thing about it is that even beyond that, if you look at what he did in 2000, 2001, the guy was still knocking in the goals. Was he knocking them in the way that he did towards the end of 99? No. But, I think you and I and every other FC Dallas fan would almost kill somebody to have a guy that can reliably score double-digit goals the way he did right about now. Now, the fact that he only scored, he wasn't scoring in the blistering pace that he was in '99. I think a lot of that spoiled a lot of us, but he was still a very productive scorer, and and like I said, it was one of those trades where you really, this team really gave up a lot, but they got a lot in return.
Yeah.
And that 99 season was, partially the Christ season, in my mind, partially the Christ season for all the reasons that you listed, but also partially the Graziani season, because I think if Graziani doesn't get to Dallas in mid-season that year, I think ultimately they run a really big risk of running out of gas as everybody and their brother starts devoting all this extra attention to Jason, and then then there just wasn't this scoring beyond Jason, to actually pick up the slack until Graziani got here. And so I kind of think of, Jason Christ is basically the face of that season just because of everything he did, and no one can ever take that away. But I don't even think that Jason is Jason that season if Graziani doesn't come to town and, basically take a lot of the heat off.
Well, we can't finish 99 without putting a bow on the season by talking about the Game 3 against Chicago in the first round of the playoffs. For a lot of people in MLS, not just FC Dallas, MLS period, for about a decade, this was considered the greatest game in MLS history. And I think it holds up even now as one of the great games of all time. 6 minutes into that game, hold on, let me set the stage for you. 6 minutes into that game, right? The Fire is already up 2-0 because Razov scores and Marsh scores. Okay? So we get into the second half. Chad Deering scores a goal 10 minutes into the second half. Somewhere along the way, Dima Kovalenko breaks Brandon Pollard's leg. And then in a 10-minute...
That was game 2.
That was game 2? I thought that was game 3. Well, either way, you set the tone for that game because Dima broke Brandon's leg in the game before then, right? So now we're late into game 3, and it's still 2-1, and there's a 10-minute window in the back end of the game. Zarco scores and Graziani scores to win the game and eliminate the Fire, who were the defending champs. So I remember watching this game going just absolutely crazy when this comeback happened. And as I said, for many people, it's the greatest game in franchise history and for a long time in MLS history.
Yeah, and I will still... I don't want to say I will fight anybody who says that it's not the greatest game in MLS history, but I think that what a lot of people put up as better games than this it's a lot of recency bias, because I remember after that second goal went in, I was just so defeated. The Burn had won game 1. I was like, all right, we're on our way. And then game 2 in Chicago, it was 4-0 Chicago. It was a first-rate ass whooping of the highest order. And, and Brandon Pollard's leg gets broken by Dima Kovalenko. So there is no way at that point, it's like, okay, we still got one more game to make this happen, And so it comes back to Dallas, and as you mentioned, Chicago's up 2-0 really quickly. And at that point, I'm so defeated because oh God, these guys are gonna roll over us. And I remember after that second goal, the crowd is deflated and just silent. And Oscar Pereira, I will always remember this, is up near the center circle, and he's just waving his hands up for the crowd to like, come on, let me hear you. He's just waving his hands up. And so, we're all like, okay, let's go. We start doing our thing again in the stands. And, okay, nothing's happening in the, initially, and then as you point out, we get the one goal, and then the second goal, it was a penalty, and the penalty comes off of. I think in any other circumstance we would say, oh, it was a kind of a harsh penalty on the Fire, because I can't remember who was taking a shot, but C.J. Brown is sliding to block it. And it goes, he's got his arm in kind of a position, but the sort of position that would seem kind of natural for anybody who's sliding at that moment. and it comes off of his arm. Referee, I can't remember who the referee is, points to the spot, and at that point, we're like, everybody's going crazy, because all right, and then Zarco puts it in, and so it's 2-2 now, and all right, we can get him in the shootout, and then as you remember, Graziani scores the winner, and at that point, I think that that game was, if I could bottle how I felt after that game, I would, that would be something that I would open up every time I feel bad about something, and it would instantly make me feel 1,000% better, because it was pure joy, pure ecstasy, and I think that is when, if that last second win in '98 was where the Brimstone Cup was conceived, I think that game is where it was actually born.
Yeah.
Because because it was just blood and guts from both teams for 3 games, and Dallas pulls it out the way that it did. I think that's where the rivalry was born, because I'm sure that Chicago fans, the ones that were around 20 years ago, they will feel to this day that the call against C.J. Brown was harsh, and where that Dallas got lucky in that game, et cetera, and they still hate Ariel Graziani irrationally, in my view, but maybe not so irrationally in their view.
Probably not.
But that game is pretty much where it was born. It's like, oh yeah, forget Kansas City. These are the guys we hate. Especially since by that point, Ron Newman, I think, had already moved on, and the Wizards were a lot less hateable.
Well, there's a reason why that game was number 1 on our list of games we thought that the FC Dallas should broadcast during this.
And it's
window.
amazing to me. Yeah, it's amazing to me that that list of games that they're broadcasting, is like 25 years of history, and all of them are like from the last 4 years.
Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to see some more. All right, Dustin, listen, I'm having a fantastic time. We're already well over an hour, so here's what I want to do. I want to shut this one down and as an individual episode, part 1, and then we're going to do a part 2 to finish up the Burn era. For you guys listening, anybody out there, that if you're enjoying this podcast or any of our other podcasts, or if you like the work we do on the website or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, consider supporting us on Patreon, as Dustin suggested. Patreon.com/Third Degree, and we'll be back, and it won't be instantaneously, but within a couple of days you'll have part 2 up of this interview. Hopefully you're enjoying the history of the Burn, and we'll see you again on the next podcast of Third Degree.